turn the TV on if you wanna see me talking on the news. I know the way you want to get down to the booth, cause voting is compulsory. All I wanna get is your first choice running in the 90s. It's a new way I like to be. I'm just running in the 90s. Come on baby, vote for me. We are running in the 90s. It's a new way to get a seat. I'm just running in the 90s. Yes, I want your vote. Yes, I want to win. And we're into the 90s, the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the internet. The 90s were very much a transition time between the old ways of doing things and the new, and Australia, under three-term Prime Minister Bob Hawke, was trying to set up Australia to make most of this new era. Since winning his largest majority yet, Hawke would continue governing Australia throughout the remainder of the 80s. However, times were changing, and so would Hawke's policies. In 1989, he would reintroduce university fees, now under the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, or HECS, which allowed uni students to take out small loans that would be paid back to the government via taxes. Along with the changes in governing, Hawke would also see Parliament move out of its current residence into the much larger building we have today. The opening ceremony would occur on the 9th of May 1988, to commemorate not only the opening of the first federal parliament on the 9th of May 1901, but also the 200th year anniversary of the first fleet arriving in Australia in 1788. However, the Hawke government would not fund the first fleet recreation ceremony over fears of offending Indigenous Australians. Despite the ceremonies and celebrations, Australia was on the verge of its worst recession since the Great Depression as stocks crashed and unemployment began to rise sharply. This was brought about by serious financial crises occurring around the world at the same time. Hawke and his treasurer Paul Keating tried to act quickly to get the situation under control, but in the end Australia just had to weather the storm. In a speech after the election, Keating would go on to say that
this is a recession that Australia had to have.
With Hawke and Labor's popularity at an all-time low, the Liberal Party would have its best shot at finally ousting Hawke and ending 7 years of Labor rule. However, first the Liberals needed to clean up their act following the disaster that was the 1987 election. In an attempt to show party unity, Liberal leader John Howard would bring back former leader Andrew Peacock as his deputy. However, this would not last, and only 2 years later Peacock and his supporters would launch a party room coup which deposed Howard and reinstated Peacock as leader. At the same time the Liberals were experiencing a coup, the Nationals were also ousting their leader. Ian Sinclair was largely seen as a poor leader after failing to stop the coalition's dissolution from the ill-fated Joe for Canberra campaign. Along with this, the Nationals felt a generation change was in order and would elect Charles Blunt as the new leader. Together, Peacock and Blunt would reform the coalition and would attempt to regain the support of the public, who had largely abandoned them in the last election. With the election called for the 24th of March, the coalition began to eye off Victoria, whose state Labor government under John Cain Jr. was deeply unpopular. Meanwhile, Labor hoped to pick off seats in Queensland, with the state's Nationals government imploding following multiple corruption allegations. However, in reality, both parties were deeply unpopular, and this led a lot of Australians to look towards third parties. Hoping to capture these disillusioned voters was the Democrats' leader Janine Haynes. Since the party's formation back in 1977, the voting count for the Democrats had steadily grown in both House and Senate, and Haynes saw the 1990 election as a chance to make a big advancement and would resign from the Senate to contest the lower house seat of Kingston in southern Adelaide. Haynes hoped this move would be the beginning of a Democrat's presence in the lower house, which would boost the party's legitimacy in the following elections. The Democrats wouldn't be the only third party attempting to win over disillusioned voters. The fallout of the Franklin Dam protest of 1983 had seen a large rise in Australians passionate about environmentalism, and they would soon begin flocking towards a series of Green parties pushing for more environmental policies. And with voters going everywhere, the outcome for the 1990 election looked to be anyone's guess. And the winner was... Initially it wasn't clear, as the Liberals picked up seats in Victoria while Labor picked up seats in Queensland. Eventually, after days of counting, Bob Hawke and Labor would emerge victorious for a historic fourth time in a row, with a net loss of 8 seats to hold 78. This surprisingly came in the face of the party losing the two-party preferred result, with only 49.9% of the vote. Labor had won by targeting specific seats in Queensland and northern New South Wales, winning them off the Nationals, whose voters had abandoned the party following the collapse of the Queensland Nationals. Labor was even successful in picking up National leader Charles Blunt's own seat of Richmond, making him only the second party leader to lose his seat in a federal election after Stanley Bruce in 1929. Labour was able to do this by courting Democrat and Greens voters over with a series of environmental policies that ensured a majority of second preference votes would flow towards Labour. For a second time, Peacock had lost to Hawke. Despite winning the two-party preferred result, Peacock had only won 69 seats, 6 seats short of a majority. Despite the party's gains in Victoria, Peacock had failed to regain the public's trust, and he would soon leave the leadership position for a second time, and would never again run for the role of Prime Minister. The election was considered a loss for both main parties as voters flocked to the Democrats and Greens, who both gained a seat in the Senate, with the Greens gaining their first. The Democrats had also seen a massive increase to their lower house vote. However, Haines would be unsuccessful in winning Kingston and thus would no longer lead the Democrats. Despite Haines' loss, former Mayor Ted Mack would win the seat of North Sydney, becoming the first independently elected Member of Parliament in over 45 years. Despite holding on to power, Hawke had lost his lustre, and with the recession getting worse, Hawke would soon have to deal with challenges not only from the opposition, but within his own party too. Come back next time for the election of 1993.